Have you ever tried to explain yourself to someone, carefully, patiently, choosing every word with precision, only to watch the misunderstanding remain exactly where it started? You clarified. You gave context. You offered the missing pieces they claimed to need. And still, somehow, they walked away, seeing you the same distorted way they saw you before you opened your mouth. Most people respond to this moment with more effort. They explain again, louder, more detailed, more desperate. They assume the problem is that they have not yet found the right words. But there is a different possibility, one that quietly reshapes everything once it is understood. Perhaps the problem was never your words at all. Perhaps some people were never going to understand you, no matter how clearly you spoke, because understanding was never actually what they were looking for. In this audiobook, you will discover why the need to be understood is one of the most exhausting and least examined burdens a person can carry, and why releasing it does not make you distant or uncaring, but quietly unbreakable. You will learn why explanation so often fails to produce the connection it promises. You will come to see misunderstanding not as a personal failure, but as an ordinary and unavoidable feature of being a separate mind, speaking to other separate minds. And you will discover what becomes possible once you stop treating other people's comprehension of you as a condition for your own peace. This is not a lesson in giving up on communication. It is not an argument for silence, coldness, or withdrawal. It is something far more precise. It is the discovery that your worth was never actually on trial in the first place, no matter how convincingly it felt that way. Somewhere between childhood and adulthood, most people quietly absorb the belief that being misunderstood is dangerous, that it must be corrected immediately, that it reflects something incomplete about who they are. That belief, rarely questioned, shapes an enormous portion of adult emotional life. It fuels anxious, over-explaining, defensive arguments, and a subtle, constant performance for an audience that was never paying as much attention as feared. What follows is a series of shifts in understanding, each one building on the last, that will slowly dismantle this belief and replace it with something sturdier. By the end, misunderstanding will no longer feel like an emergency. It will feel like weather, something that passes through, rarely something that defines you. Chapter 1. The myth that understanding equals safety. There is a belief so early and so quiet that most people never notice they carry it. It forms before language is fully developed, back in the years when a child's entire world depends on being correctly read by the adults around them. When a child cries and a parent understands the cry as hunger, the child is fed. When a child cries and the cry is understood as fear, the child is comforted. In those early years, being understood is not a luxury. It is survival. The infant mind quietly absorbs a lesson that will echo for decades. To be understood is to be safe. To be misunderstood is to be at risk. This lesson made sense in the nursery. It stops making sense almost everywhere else, yet it rarely gets updated. The nervous system that once depended on accurate interpretation for its very survival grows into an adult body that no longer requires this. A grown person misunderstood by a coworker, a stranger online, or a distant relative faces no genuine danger. No food is withheld, no safety is removed. And yet the old alarm still sounds, the same one that once meant something urgent, now firing over a comment that carries no real consequence at all. This is why misunderstanding so often produces a reaction that feels wildly disproportionate to the actual event. A single comma-level misreading of a text message can trigger hours of rumination. A colleague's confused expression during a meeting can replay in the mind, long after the meeting has ended. The intensity of the reaction rarely matches the size of the incident, because the reaction is not actually about the incident. It is about an old, deeply wired association between comprehension and protection, one formed long before conscious memory begins. Consider how this plays out in ordinary adult life. A person makes a decision, perhaps to leave a job, end a friendship, or change a long-held plan. Almost immediately, an internal pressure appears, a pull toward explaining the decision fully, toward making sure everyone involved understands exactly why it happened. This pressure often gets mistaken for consideration, for basic courtesy toward others. Sometimes it is exactly that, but often, underneath the polite reasoning, there is something else entirely. A quiet fear that if the decision is left unexplained, it will be read as wrong. And if it is read as wrong, something bad will follow. The explanation is not really for the other person. It is an offering made to an old internal alarm system, an attempt to purchase safety, the only way the nervous system knows how, through being correctly understood. The trouble is, this system was never designed for the world adults actually live in a small tribe or a small household. Being misread by someone truly could threaten your standing, your resources, even your physical safety. But most adult misunderstandings today occur with people who hold no real power over your life. A stranger's misjudgment on a comment section changes nothing material about your existence. A distant acquaintance's inaccurate opinion of your choices does not remove your ability to eat, work, or belong. The threat has dissolved, but the ancient wiring that treats misunderstanding as danger has not received the update. This mismatch explains why so many capable, intelligent adults still find themselves unsettled for hours by a single misinterpreted remark. It is not a character flaw. It is an outdated protective mechanism, doing precisely what it was built to do, only aimed at situations it was never designed to evaluate. Recognizing this mismatch is the first real turning point. Once a person sees that the anxious pull to be understood is often an old alarm rather than an accurate signal of present danger, something begins to loosen. The urgency softens, even slightly, because urgency requires believing that something real is at stake. None of this means understanding never matters. In close relationships, in genuine partnerships, comprehension remains valuable, worth pursuing patiently over time. The distinction that matters is between mattering and mattering urgently, between valuing understanding and treating its absence as an emergency. A person can care whether a close friend understands their perspective and still remain entirely calm when a stranger does not. The difference lies in recognizing which situations are genuinely tied to safety and connection, and which ones are simply triggering an inherited reflex with nothing real behind it. As this distinction becomes clearer, an unexpected kind of freedom begins to emerge. The compulsion to explain, defend, and clarify starts losing its grip, not because explanation itself is abandoned, but because it is no longer driven by fear. What was once an anxious reflex becomes, instead, a conscious choice, offered only where it is genuinely wanted and genuinely useful. This shift, subtle as it may seem, marks the beginning of a much larger transformation, one that unfolds slowly across the chapters that follow, but which starts here, with a single recognition. Understanding was never actually the thing keeping you safe. It only felt that way, because once, a very long time ago it was. Chapter 2. Why? Every explanation meets a different mind. Picture two people standing at the same window, looking out at the same street. One sees a quiet neighborhood, familiar and calm. The other sees a place associated with a difficult memory from years earlier, and something in their chest tightens without quite knowing why. Same window, same street, two entirely different experiences. This simple scene captures something that most people forget. In the middle of a conversation, they desperately want someone to understand. There is no such thing as a neutral listener. When words leave your mouth, they do not travel into an empty space and land intact inside another person's mind. They travel into a mind already furnished, already shaped by decades of experience, wounds, assumptions, cultural conditioning, mood, fatigue, and private history that you may never fully know. Your words do not arrive as pure information. They arrive filtered, refracted, and reassembled by whatever architecture already exists inside the listener. This is not a flaw in communication. It is the basic condition of communication itself. This explains something that puzzles many people for years. Why the same explanation, delivered with equal clarity, lands perfectly with one listener and completely misses another. The explanation did not change. The receiving mind did. A person who grew up around constant criticism may hear gentle feedback as an attack. A person who has been betrayed before may hear an innocent question as an accusation. A person distracted by their own private stress may absorb only a fragment of what was said, then unconsciously fill in the missing pieces with assumptions drawn from their own anxieties, rather than your actual words. None of this happens because your explanation was poorly constructed. It happens because comprehension is never simply about the words spoken. It is about the words spoken, filtered through a mind you do not control and often cannot fully see into. This single realization dismantles a quiet, exhausting belief that many people carry without examining it. The belief that if a misunderstanding occurs, it must mean the explanation was insufficient. Under this belief, every failure to be understood becomes evidence of a communication failure that must be corrected through more effort, more detail, more precision. But if the listener's mind is doing at least half of the interpretive work, then no amount of refinement on your end can guarantee a particular outcome on theirs. You can control the clarity of what you send. You cannot control what the other mind does with it once it arrives. This does not mean clear communication does not matter. It matters greatly. Vague, careless, or contradictory language genuinely does create unnecessary confusion. And refining how you express yourself remains a valuable skill throughout life. But there is a meaningful difference between improving clarity and believing that perfect clarity guarantees perfect understanding. The first is a reasonable, achievable goal. The second is a quiet trap, because it assumes a level of control over another person's internal processing that no one actually has. Consider how differently this plays out depending on who is listening. Explain a difficult decision to someone who trusts you deeply, and they will often extend generous interpretation, filling gaps with goodwill rather than suspicion. Explain the very same decision, using the very same words, to someone who has already formed a negative opinion of you, and watch as neutral statements get quietly reinterpreted as confirmation of what they already believed. The explanation did not change. The filter through which it passed did. This is why arguing harder rarely repairs a misunderstanding rooted in a pre-existing negative filter. You are not really arguing against their confusion. You are arguing against months or years of accumulated interpretation that has nothing to do with the specific sentence currently being spoken. Once this becomes clear, something important shifts in how misunderstanding feels. It stops feeling like a personal failure and starts looking like an ordinary, expected outcome of two separate minds attempting to meet across the gap that always exists between them. This reframing does not make communication meaningless. It makes it more honest. You begin communicating not with the fantasy of guaranteed comprehension, but with the more realistic goal of offering clarity as generously as you can, then releasing your grip on how it gets received. This release is not indifference. It is simply an accurate understanding of where your responsibility ends and another person's interpretation begins. Chapter 3. The hidden cost of constant clarification. There is a particular kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with physical exertion. It appears after a long conversation in which nothing physically demanding occurred, and yet the body feels drained in a way that resembles exhaustion after hard labor. This is the tiredness of constant clarification, the quiet toll taken by a life spent explaining, justifying, and re-explaining choices that never actually required defense in the first place. Most people never calculate this cost directly because it accumulates in small, almost invisible increments. A brief justification here for choosing to skip a gathering, a longer explanation there for a career change, a defensive clarification for a parenting choice, a financial decision, a relationship boundary. Individually, each explanation seems reasonable, even necessary. But stacked across years, these moments form a pattern that quietly reshapes how a person relates to their own decisions. The first cost is energy. Explaining yourself, especially when done under a subtle undertone of anxiety, consumes disproportionate mental resources. The mind does not simply state facts during these moments. It scans for the right words, anticipates objections, prepares counter-arguments, and monitors the listener's face for signs of doubt or disapproval, all while trying to appear calm rather than defensive. This is a significant cognitive load, repeated many times across a single week, drawn from the same limited reserve of attention and willpower that could otherwise fuel actual growth, actual work, actual rest. The second cost is subtler and considerably more damaging over time: the erosion of self-trust. Each time a person feels compelled to justify a decision that genuinely required no justification, a quiet message gets reinforced somewhere beneath conscious awareness. The message is this: my judgment alone is not sufficient. It needs outside validation to be considered legitimate. Repeated often enough, this message becomes a kind of internal habit, a reflexive assumption that decisions are not truly settled until someone else has approved of them. This creates a strange dependency, one where a person can make a perfectly sound choice and still feel unsettled about it, not because the choice was wrong, but because it has not yet passed through the filter of another person's understanding. Over years, this dependency compounds. A person who constantly seeks validation for their reasoning gradually loses touch with the felt sense of simply knowing something is right, without needing anyone else to confirm it. This felt sense, sometimes called internal confidence, is not something people are simply born with or without. It is built, decision by decision, through the accumulated experience of trusting your own judgment and observing that this trust was justified. Constant clarification interrupts this building process at its root because it habitually outsources the final verdict to someone else's reaction rather than allowing that verdict to settle internally. There is also a relational cost, one that seems paradoxical at first. Many people believe that explaining themselves thoroughly builds stronger relationships, since it demonstrates transparency and care. In moderate amounts, within relationships built on mutual trust, this is often true. But when explanation becomes constant and anxious, rather than occasional and genuine, it can quietly shift the dynamic of a relationship in an unhealthy direction. It can position the other person, even unintentionally, as a kind of judge whose approval must be regularly earned, rather than an equal participant in a relationship of mutual respect. Over time, this dynamic can create exactly the kind of scrutiny it was meant to avoid, because people naturally begin to question things more closely when someone around them seems perpetually ready to defend even the smallest decisions. Perhaps the most significant hidden cost, though, is the way constant clarification steals attention away from the present moment. A mind occupied with rehearsing explanations, anticipating objections, and monitoring reactions is a mind that is only partially present in its own life. Conversations become less about genuine connection and more about successful navigation. Decisions become less about aligned values and more about anticipated scrutiny. Slowly, without any single dramatic moment marking the shift, a person can find themselves living somewhat defensively, always half-braced for the need to explain, rather than simply living. Recognizing this cost does not mean explanation should be abandoned entirely, nor does it mean withholding context from people who genuinely deserve it. It means developing the ability to distinguish between explanation offered freely, from a place of connection, and explanation extracted anxiously, from a place of fear. The first strengthens relationships and requires little energy, because it flows naturally rather than being forced. The second drains energy steadily and rarely produces the safety it is reaching for. Learning to notice which kind of explanation is currently in motion, and choosing, increasingly, to offer only the first kind, becomes one of the most quietly powerful shifts a person can make. Chapter 4. When people do not want to understand you. There is an assumption buried inside most attempts at explanation, one so automatic it rarely gets examined directly. The assumption is this: if I simply explain myself clearly enough, the other person will understand. This assumption treats misunderstanding as a temporary technical problem, something correctable through better wording, more patience, or additional context. For many situations, this assumption holds true, but for a specific and important category of situations, it does not, and continuing to operate as though it does can lead to years of exhausting, fruitless effort. Some people do not misunderstand you by accident. They misunderstand you by design, whether consciously chosen or not. Their interpretation of your behavior is not primarily built from evidence about you. It is built from something else entirely: a need to protect their own self-image, their own prior decisions, or their own worldview. For these individuals, updating their understanding of you would require confronting something uncomfortable about themselves, and confronting that discomfort feels far more threatening than simply continuing to hold an inaccurate view. Consider a common pattern. A person makes a significant life change, perhaps leaving a stable but unfulfilling career to pursue something less conventional. A relative who made the opposite choice years earlier, staying in stability despite quiet dissatisfaction, hears about this change and reacts with unexpected criticism, even hostility. On the surface, this reaction appears to be about the choice itself. Underneath, it is often about something else entirely. If the person who left was making a reasonable, even admirable decision, then the relative's own earlier choice to stay begins to look, at least internally, like a road not taken out of fear rather than wisdom. Rather than sit with that uncomfortable possibility, it becomes far easier to interpret the other person's choice as reckless, naive, or irresponsible. The misunderstanding is not really about missing information. It is a psychological defense disguised as an opinion. This dynamic appears constantly, in smaller and larger forms, throughout ordinary life. A person who sets a boundary may be labeled as cold by someone who benefited from that person having no boundaries at all. A person who succeeds may be labeled as lucky or arrogant by someone who needs to protect their own narrative about why they have not yet succeeded themselves. A person who chooses peace over conflict may be labeled as weak by someone who equates constant reaction with strength, because reaction is the only tool they have ever developed. In each case, more explanation rarely resolves anything, because the misunderstanding was never really about lacking information in the first place. This is a genuinely uncomfortable truth to accept, because it removes the comforting illusion that misunderstanding is always solvable through enough patience and clarity. It can feel almost insulting to consider that someone might prefer their inaccurate view of you over an accurate one. But once accepted, this truth becomes strangely liberating. It releases you from an impossible task, the task of convincing someone who has strong motivation to remain unconvinced. No quality of explanation can overcome a listener's need to protect their own psychological comfort. Recognizing this early, rather than after years of exhausting effort, spares enormous amounts of energy that can be redirected toward relationships and pursuits that are actually capable of growth. Recognizing this pattern also requires a certain discernment, since not every disagreement or confusion falls into this category. Many misunderstandings genuinely are accidental, rooted in incomplete information, poor timing, or simple miscommunication, and these situations often do respond well to patient clarification. The skill worth developing is not blanket suspicion toward every misunderstanding, but rather an honest, observant read of the pattern over time. Does additional clarity actually shift this person's view, even slightly? Or does each new explanation get absorbed and reinterpreted to fit an existing conclusion that seems immovable regardless of evidence? The first pattern suggests a genuine misunderstanding worth addressing. The second suggests something else, a fixed narrative that explanation cannot touch, no matter how carefully constructed. Once this distinction becomes clear, a different kind of freedom becomes available. You no longer need to interpret every unresolved misunderstanding as a personal failure, requiring further effort. Some misunderstandings are simply not yours to solve, because they were never actually about you to begin with. They were about the listener's own internal architecture, their own need to protect a particular version of themselves or their world. Letting go of the responsibility to fix these particular misunderstandings does not make you distant or uncaring. It makes you accurate, finally seeing the situation for what it actually is, rather than what your old instinct insists it must be. Chapter 5. The difference between being known and being approved of. Two experiences often get treated as though they are the same thing, when in fact, they sit at opposite ends of something far more important than either one alone. The first experience is being known. Having another person see your actual reasoning, your actual values, the real architecture behind your choices, even when they might choose differently themselves. The second experience is being approved of, having another person express agreement, admiration, or endorsement of what you have done. These two experiences frequently occur together, which is precisely why they get confused. But they are not the same, and the difference between them shapes an enormous portion of emotional life. Being known does not require agreement. A close friend can fully understand why you made a difficult decision, can see the exact reasoning, the exact values, the exact weighing of costs and benefits that led you there, and still personally believe they would have chosen differently in your position. This is being known without being approved of. And it is one of the deepest, most stabilizing experiences available in human connection, precisely because it does not depend on convincing anyone that your choice was correct. It only requires that they see it clearly, as it actually is. Approval, by contrast, requires something more fragile: alignment. For approval to occur, the other person must not only understand your reasoning, but actively agree with it, actively endorse it as the right path. This is a much narrower target to hit, since it depends not only on how clearly you communicate, but on whether the listener's own values, experiences, and current mood happen to align with your choice. Approval can be withheld even from a person who fully understands you, simply because understanding and agreement are two entirely separate outcomes. The trouble begins when approval quietly becomes the actual goal, disguised as a pursuit of understanding. This substitution happens gradually and rarely announces itself directly. It shows up as a subtle dissatisfaction that lingers even after someone has clearly grasped your explanation. They understood. They even said as much. And yet, something still feels unfinished, unresolved, because what was actually being sought underneath the surface was not comprehension but agreement, not being seen accurately but being told, implicitly or explicitly, that the choice was good. When approval to arrive, even genuine understanding can feel unsatisfying, hollow, incomplete. This substitution creates a particular kind of exhausting relationship pattern. A person keeps explaining, elaborating, adding context, not because the listener remains confused, but because the listener remains unconvinced, and somewhere beneath conscious awareness, conviction has been mistaken for the actual finish line. This is a race that can continue indefinitely, because some listeners will never fully agree, no matter how much additional context arrives, simply because their disagreement is rooted in their own values rather than any missing piece of information. Chasing their approval under the belief that one more explanation will finally produce it becomes a task with no natural stopping point. Untangling these two needs, the need to be known and the need to be approved of, requires a specific kind of honest self-examination. When you find yourself wanting someone to understand a decision, it is worth pausing to ask what exactly would feel satisfying if it arrived. Would it feel complete simply to know they see your reasoning clearly, even if they still disagree with your conclusion? Or would anything short of their explicit endorsement continue to feel unfinished? The first answer points toward a genuine desire to be known, a need that can be met even amid disagreement. The second answer points toward a hidden pursuit of approval, a need that may never be fully satisfied by any amount of explanation because it depends on factors entirely outside your control. There is real freedom available once this distinction becomes clear. Being known remains a reasonable, healthy desire, one worth pursuing in relationships that matter, through honest conversation and patient mutual effort. But approval, chased as though it were the same thing, becomes an endless pursuit, since it requires managing not just your own honesty, but another person's entire value system, something no amount of skillful explanation can guarantee. Releasing the need for approval, while still valuing genuine understanding, allows relationships to become steadier and far less exhausting. You can be fully known by someone who disagrees with you and walk away from that conversation feeling entirely at peace. Because What you were actually seeking, to be seen clearly, was fully delivered, even without the endorsement you once believed, was required to feel complete. Chapter 6. Misunderstanding is not evidence against you. There is a quiet courtroom that many people carry inside their minds, one that convenes without invitation whenever someone misreads them. In this courtroom, misunderstanding is treated as testimony, as though the fact that someone reached the wrong conclusion about you proves something true about your character, your worth, or your competence. A friend misinterprets a comment, and the internal verdict arrives almost instantly. I must have said it wrong. I must be difficult to understand. I must be somehow at fault. This reflex feels so automatic that most people never pause to examine whether the verdict is actually justified. It rarely is. Misunderstanding is not evidence. It is an event. Something happened between two minds, and the outcome did not match the intention. This is closer to a weather report than a legal ruling, a description of what occurred, rather than a judgment about who deserves blame. Yet the mind, trained by years of treating comprehension as safety, instinctively reaches for the courtroom model instead, converting a neutral event into a verdict against the self. Consider what actually determines whether understanding occurs in any given interaction. It depends on the clarity of the words chosen. Certainly, but it also depends on the listener's mood. In that particular moment, their level of fatigue, their prior history with similar topics, their cultural background, their personal insecurities, the amount of attention they happen to be paying, and countless other variables that exist entirely outside the speaker's control. Given this enormous list of contributing factors, it becomes almost statistically strange to expect perfect understanding every time, and equally strange to treat every failure as proof of some personal deficiency. A misunderstanding could just as easily result from the listener's distraction as from any flaw in the explanation offered. This reframing does something important to the emotional weight misunderstanding carries. If misunderstanding is evidence against you, then every instance of it demands an emotional response proportional to an accusation, something requiring immediate defense, correction, or repair. But if misunderstanding is simply an event, a mismatch between two minds operating with different information and different filters, then it demands nothing more than curiosity. Perhaps a mild interest in whether clarification would be useful without the accompanying alarm. There is a useful distinction worth developing here between the content of a misunderstanding and the meaning automatically assigned to it. The content might be something as simple as, a colleague believed you missed a deadline intentionally, when in fact you were waiting on information from someone else. The meaning automatically assigned might be something far larger and more damaging. I am seen as unreliable. This reflects poorly on my character. I need to fix this immediately, or something important will be lost. Notice how much larger the assigned meaning is, compared to the actual content of the event. This gap between what actually happened and what it is interpreted to mean is where most of the unnecessary suffering around misunderstanding actually lives. Closing this gap does not require ignoring misunderstanding or pretending it never matters. It requires separating the practical question, is there something useful to clarify here, from the emotional question, does this event reveal something troubling about who I am? The practical question can usually be answered calmly, sometimes with a brief clarification, sometimes with nothing at all, if the stakes are low. The emotional question, when examined honestly, almost always reveals that the answer is no. This event reveals something about the limitations of communication between separate minds, not a hidden truth about personal inadequacy. This shift becomes especially important when misunderstanding comes from people who barely know you. A stranger's snap judgment, formed from a single comment or a brief interaction, carries almost no actual information about who you are, since it is built from such a narrow slice of context. And yet, these strangers' misjudgments often trigger disproportionate reactions, precisely because the old alarm system does not discriminate between a misunderstanding from someone deeply invested in your life and a misunderstanding from someone who will forget the interaction within the hour. Learning to notice this discrepancy and to calibrate your emotional response according to the actual significance of the relationship involved prevents an enormous amount of unnecessary distress. Ultimately, this recognition changes the entire posture with which a person moves through a world full of imperfect communication. Instead of treating each misunderstanding as a small trial to be won or lost, it becomes possible to treat it as simply part of the ordinary texture of being a separate consciousness attempting to connect with other separate consciousnesses. Sometimes the connection lands cleanly, sometimes it does not. Neither outcome says anything definitive about your worth. It only says something about the inherent difficulty of translation between two different inner worlds, a difficulty that has existed for as long as humans have attempted to understand one another, and will continue long after any single misunderstanding has faded from memory. Chapter 7. The quiet confidence of letting a misunderstanding stand. There is a particular moment, small and easy to overlook, that reveals more about a person's inner stability than almost any other. It is the moment when a misunderstanding occurs, correction is possible, and the person chooses, deliberately, not to pursue it. Not out of avoidance, not out of fear, but out of a calm assessment that correcting this particular misunderstanding is not worth the cost involved. This moment, repeated over time, builds something that constant clarification never can. Quiet confidence, the kind that does not need to announce itself or prove itself to remain intact. Most people have never practiced this deliberately. The instinct to correct runs so deep that leaving a misunderstanding uncorrected can feel almost unbearable in the moment, like an open wound left untreated. But consider what actually happens when a minor misunderstanding is allowed to remain. A distant acquaintance believes something slightly inaccurate about why you left a job, or why you declined an invitation, or what your opinion is on some minor matter. In most cases, this inaccurate belief changes nothing meaningful about your actual life. It exists somewhere in another person's mind, occupying a small amount of space, largely irrelevant to your daily reality, your relationships that matter, or your sense of self. Choosing to let this kind of misunderstanding stand is not the same as being lazy or avoidant. It is an act of discernment, a recognition that not every inaccurate impression requires your energy to fix. This discernment requires a specific kind of internal calculation, one that most people never consciously perform, weighing the actual cost of the misunderstanding remaining against the actual cost of correcting it. Often, when this calculation is done honestly, the cost of correction, in energy, in time, in the subtle anxiety of managing how you are perceived, outweighs the relatively minor cost of a stranger or distant acquaintance holding a slightly inaccurate view. There is something almost paradoxical about the confidence this practice builds. It might seem that correcting every misunderstanding would demonstrate strength, an unwillingness to be mischaracterized. In practice, the opposite tends to be true. A person who feels compelled to correct every inaccurate impression reveals, through that very compulsion, how much power they have granted to other people's perceptions. Each correction, however reasonable it might seem individually, quietly communicates, "Your opinion of me matters enough that I cannot let this stand." Repeated often enough, across every minor misunderstanding, this pattern reinforces a fragile foundation, one that requires constant maintenance to remain steady. Letting a misunderstanding stand, by contrast, communicates something entirely different, even if no words are spoken about it at all. It communicates that your sense of self does not depend on this particular person's accurate perception of you. This is not coldness. It is not indifference to truth. It is simply an accurate recognition that truth, in this instance, does not require your defense in order to remain true. You still know what actually happened. You still understand your own reasoning. The fact that someone else holds a different, less accurate picture does not alter the underlying reality. It only means that reality exists, for now, unwitnessed by that particular person. This practice becomes easier with deliberate, small-scale repetition. It rarely makes sense to begin with high-stakes misunderstandings involving people whose opinions genuinely matter to your daily life. It makes far more sense to begin with low-stakes situations, a minor mischaracterization from an acquaintance, an inaccurate assumption from someone you interact with rarely. In these lower-stakes moments, the instinct to correct can be noticed, examined, and set aside deliberately, allowing the discomfort of leaving something uncorrected to be felt and tolerated without any real consequence following. Over time, this tolerance grows, and the automatic compulsion to correct every inaccuracy begins to loosen its grip. There is a particular kind of relief that arrives once this practice becomes familiar. It is the relief of realizing that you do not actually need to manage everyone's perception of you at all times, that some inaccurate impressions can simply exist without threatening anything essential. This relief compounds over time into something larger, a quiet, durable confidence that does not depend on being universally understood. It depends instead on your own clear-eyed knowledge of your own reasoning, a knowledge that remains stable, regardless of how many people around you happen to see it accurately in any given moment. This is the quiet confidence available on the other side of letting a misunderstanding stand. Not the confidence of having convinced everyone, but the far sturdier confidence of no longer needing to. Chapter 8. How over-explaining trains people to doubt you. There is an assumption worth examining closely, one that seems almost self-evidently true, until it is tested against actual observation. The assumption is that more explanation produces more trust, that the more thoroughly you justify a decision, the more confidence others will have in that decision's soundness. In moderate doses, within appropriate contexts, this can be true, but past a certain threshold, something counterintuitive begins to happen. Excessive explanation does not build trust. It quietly erodes it, training listeners, often without either party realizing it, to treat every statement as something requiring scrutiny. Consider how confidence is typically communicated between people, apart from words. A person who states a decision plainly, without elaborate justification, without visible anxiety about how it will be received, tends to be read as someone secure in their reasoning. The brevity itself carries information. This decision required no extensive defense because it did not feel precarious to the person making it. Contrast this with a person who explains the same decision at great length, anticipating objections before they arise, offering justification upon justification, watching the listener's face for signs of doubt. Even if the content of both explanations is identical, the extended version often produces more suspicion, not less, because the sheer volume of defense implies, whether accurately or not, that defense was genuinely needed. This happens because listeners, consciously or not, read effort as a signal. When something requires extensive justification, the assumption forms that it must be justifiable only with effort, that a straightforward, uncomplicated truth would not need so much scaffolding to support it. This is not always a fair assumption, since some genuinely sound decisions are simply complex enough to require longer explanation. But in ordinary daily interactions, where most decisions are not actually that complicated, an unusually long defense of a simple choice tends to raise more questions than it resolves. The listener begins to wonder what is being compensated for, even when nothing actually is. There is also a subtler mechanism at work, one involving the anxious energy that often accompanies over-explanation. Anxiety is remarkably contagious in conversation. When a person explains something, while visibly anxious about the outcome, monitoring the listener's reaction, adjusting the explanation mid-sentence based on subtle facial cues, this anxiety transmits itself to the listener. Even if the listener cannot articulate exactly why, they suddenly feel uncertain. The listener begins to mirror the speaker's own uncertainty, not because the content of the explanation was flawed, but because anxious energy tends to generate corresponding anxious energy in whoever receives it. Calm, by contrast, tends to generate calm. A person who explains something briefly and without visible tension invites the listener into that same steadiness, making agreement, or at least acceptance, far more likely. This dynamic creates an uncomfortable trap for anyone caught inside the habit of over-explaining. The habit typically forms from a desire to be believed, to be trusted, to avoid the discomfort of being doubted. But the habit itself, through the mechanisms described above, often produces exactly the outcome it was trying to avoid. More explanation generates more scrutiny. More scrutiny generates more anxious explanation in response. This loop can continue indefinitely, each round reinforcing the belief that still more explanation is needed, when in fact the opposite adjustment would produce a better result. Escaping this loop requires a genuinely counterintuitive move, saying less, not more, particularly in moments when the internal pressure to elaborate feels strongest. This does not mean withholding relevant information or being evasive when genuine questions are asked. It means resisting the urge to preemptively justify, to answer objections that have not actually been raised, to fill silence with additional reassurance that nobody actually requested. A simple, calmly stated decision, followed by comfortable silence, rather than anxious elaboration, often produces far more confidence in listeners than the most thorough defense ever could. This shift requires tolerating a particular kind of discomfort, the discomfort of silence after a statement, the discomfort of not knowing exactly what the listener is thinking, the discomfort of resisting the urge to fill every gap with additional words. But this discomfort, tolerated repeatedly, gradually transforms into something valuable. The lived experience of discovering that brevity, delivered calmly, tends to be believed more readily than elaborate justification, delivered anxiously. Over time, this discovery becomes internalized, no longer requiring conscious effort to apply. What remains is a way of communicating that inspires trust, not through the volume of words offered, but through the quiet steadiness with which far fewer words are spoken. Chapter 9. Building an inner reference point nobody can shift. Somewhere beneath the constant activity of daily decisions, most people carry an invisible reference point, a place their mind automatically checks whenever uncertainty arises about whether a choice was correct. For many people, this reference point sits entirely outside themselves. It exists in the reactions of others, in the approval or disapproval reflected back through facial expressions, comments, and silences. This external reference point can shift constantly, moment to moment, person to person, making genuine internal stability almost impossible to sustain. Building an internal reference point instead, one that does not depend on external confirmation, represents one of the most significant developments available in an adult life. An internal reference point is not the same as stubbornness, nor is it a refusal to consider other perspectives. It is something more specific, a settled, examined understanding of your own values, priorities, and reasoning, developed through honest reflection, rather than borrowed from whoever happens to be present at any given moment. When this reference point exists, a decision can be evaluated by checking it against your own carefully considered principles, rather than by scanning the room for signs of approval. The difference between these two processes might look similar from the outside, but internally, they produce entirely different experiences of stability. Building this reference point begins with a practice many people have never seriously undertaken: articulating clearly and specifically what actually matters to you and why. This sounds simple, but most people operate on inherited assumptions about what should matter, absorbed from family, culture, or social environment, without ever examining whether these assumptions genuinely align with their own considered values. A useful starting exercise involves examining a recent decision that produced disapproval from someone else, and asking honestly, setting aside their reaction entirely, do I still believe this was the right choice, based on my own reasoning? This question, asked repeatedly across many decisions, gradually reveals the contours of an internal value system that may have been operating quietly all along, waiting to be consciously recognized. An internal reference point also requires developing comfort with a specific kind of uncertainty. The uncertainty of not having immediate external confirmation that a decision was correct. Most decisions in life do not come with instant, objective verification. Their outcomes unfold slowly, sometimes over years, and during the waiting period, the temptation to seek premature validation from others can feel overwhelming. Learning to tolerate this waiting period without collapsing the uncertainty prematurely by seeking reassurance strengthens the internal reference point considerably. Each time uncertainty is tolerated without seeking external rescue, the internal system grows slightly more capable of holding steady on its own. There is a particular skill worth developing here, sometimes described as internal witnessing. This involves observing your own reasoning process as it unfolds, almost as a curious third party, rather than an anxious participant. When facing a difficult decision, internal witnessing might sound like, I notice I am weighing these particular factors. I notice which outcome I am leaning toward. I notice why. This practice, repeated consistently, builds familiarity with your own decision-making process, which, in turn, builds trust in that process. Trust built through direct observation of your own reasoning tends to be far sturdier than trust borrowed temporarily from someone else's approval, because it does not disappear the moment that approval is withdrawn. It is worth being clear about what an internal reference point is not. It is not a rejection of feedback, advice, or the genuine insight that other people can offer. Wise counsel from people who know you well remains valuable throughout life, and an internal reference point does not mean ignoring this counsel out of stubborn self-reliance. The distinction lies in how that counsel gets processed. Without an internal reference point, external feedback tends to simply overwrite whatever internal sense existed beforehand, leaving a person perpetually reshaped by whoever spoke most recently or most forcefully. With an internal reference point established, external feedback becomes information to be weighed against an existing internal standard. Considered thoughtfully, sometimes incorporated, sometimes respectfully set aside, but never simply absorbed wholesale without evaluation. As this internal reference point strengthens over time, something noticeable begins to change in how misunderstanding and disagreement are experienced. They stop feeling like threats to be urgently resolved, because the internal foundation no longer depends on external confirmation to remain steady. A misunderstanding can occur, disagreement can arise, disapproval can be expressed, and underneath all of it, the internal reference point continues holding its position, unmoved, because it was never actually built on the shifting ground of other people's reactions in the first place. This stability, cultivated deliberately over time, becomes one of the most durable forms of peace, available to anyone willing to do the quiet, patient work of building it. Chapter 10. The people who understand you without being told. There is a specific kind of relief that arrives in certain relationships, one that feels almost startling the first time it is genuinely experienced. It is the relief of not having to explain, not because explanation is being avoided, but because it simply is not needed. Because the other person already grasps what is happening, sometimes before you have even fully articulated it yourself. This kind of understanding cannot be manufactured through better wording or more patient clarification. It emerges from something deeper, something built over time, through consistent attention, shared experience, and a particular quality of attunement that cannot be rushed. Most of the exhausting work described throughout this journey, the constant clarification, the anxious over-explanation, the desperate pursuit of comprehension, tends to occur most intensely with people who do not actually have this kind of attunement toward you. This is not necessarily anyone's fault. Attunement takes time to build, and it requires a particular kind of mutual investment that not every relationship, even close ones, happens to include. Recognizing this distinction between relationships with genuine attunement and relationships without it changes how effort gets allocated. It becomes less necessary to pour enormous energy into being understood by everyone, and more valuable to notice, appreciate, and nurture the specific relationships where understanding already flows with relatively little effort. What actually produces this kind of effortless understanding between two people? It rarely comes from shared opinions or identical life circumstances. Though these can sometimes help, it comes more consistently from sustained attention, the kind that notices patterns over time, rather than reacting to isolated incidents. A person who has watched you navigate stress across many years develops a working model of how you tend to respond, what your silence usually means, what your humor signals when things are difficult, what your withdrawal indicates versus what your directness indicates. This model, built slowly through repeated observation, allows them to interpret your behavior accurately, even in moments when you have not explained anything at all. because the explanation has effectively already been provided, incrementally, across years of consistent presence. This kind of attunement also depends on a particular quality of attention that not everyone naturally offers. Attention oriented toward understanding rather than toward judgment. Some people observe others primarily to evaluate them, sorting behavior into categories of acceptable and unacceptable, admirable and disappointing. This orientation, however subtle, tends to prevent the deeper kind of understanding being described here, because judgment and comprehension pull attention in different directions. Judgment asks, is this right or wrong? Understanding asks, what is actually happening here, and why? People capable of consistently choosing the second question over the first tend to become the rare individuals who understand others without requiring constant explanation, because their attention has been oriented all along toward genuine comprehension rather than evaluation. Recognizing which relationships in your life carry this quality of attunement is itself a valuable exercise. It often requires looking past the relationships that seem, on the surface, like they should offer the most understanding: family ties, long friendships, romantic partnerships, and instead examining actual patterns of interaction. Does this person, when you share something difficult, respond with genuine curiosity about your experience? Or do they respond quickly with their own interpretation, layered over your actual meaning, before you have finished speaking? Does this person remember context from previous conversations, weaving it naturally into how they interpret your current situation? Or does each conversation start fresh, disconnected from what came before? These patterns, observed honestly over time, reveal which relationships actually carry the attunement being described, regardless of how much history or formal closeness exists on paper. There is an important implication that follows from this recognition. If effortless understanding depends on attunement built through sustained, judgment-free attention, then it makes little sense to expect this same effortless understanding from people who have not built that attunement, no matter how much you might wish they had. A new acquaintance, a distant relative, a colleague you rarely interact with. None of these people have had the opportunity to build the kind of working model that produces easy comprehension. Expecting this level of understanding from them, and feeling wounded when it does not appear, misunderstands what actually produces understanding in the first place. It is not owed. It is built, slowly, through consistent presence and attention, and it simply has not had time to develop in these newer or more distant relationships. This recognition redirects energy in a useful direction. Rather than exhausting yourself trying to produce instant understanding in relationships that have not yet built the foundation for it, energy can be invested instead in nurturing the relationships where attunement already exists, deepening them further, and in patiently allowing newer relationships the time they genuinely need to develop this quality, if they are going to develop it at all. Some relationships will never build this kind of attunement, and that is not a failure requiring correction. It is simply the natural variation that exists across the many different kinds of connection available in a single life. Some destined for effortless understanding, others valuable in entirely different ways, without ever needing to carry that particular quality at all. Chapter 11. Releasing the need to be seen a certain way. There is a subtle, constant labor that many people perform without ever naming it directly. The labor of managing how they are perceived. It shows up in small adjustments made before speaking, in careful word choices designed to project a particular image, in the quiet calculation that runs beneath many social interactions, weighing not just what is true, but how the truth will be read. This labor often feels invisible, precisely because it has become so habitual, woven into the background of daily interaction so thoroughly that its constant presence goes largely unnoticed. And yet it consumes real energy, energy that could otherwise be directed toward genuine connection, genuine work, or genuine rest. This labor is different from the simple, healthy desire to communicate clearly or to be kind in how you present yourself to others. It becomes something else entirely when it shifts from wanting to be clear toward wanting to control, when the underlying goal is no longer accurate communication, but a specific, curated impression that must be carefully maintained across every interaction. This shift often happens gradually, without a single dramatic moment marking its arrival. It builds instead from years of small experiences, moments where a particular image, competent, agreeable, strong, easygoing, produced approval or safety, while deviations from that image produced discomfort or criticism. Over time, maintaining the image becomes the goal itself, sometimes eclipsing the more basic goal of simply existing honestly. The trouble with this pursuit is that it depends on an impossible task: controlling how other separate minds interpret you. As established earlier in this journey, every listener filters incoming information through their own history, assumptions, and current state of mind. This means that even with flawless self-presentation, perfectly chosen words, and perfectly managed behavior, the resulting impression in someone else's mind remains only partially within your control. Two people can witness the identical behavior and form entirely different conclusions about what it reveals, based on filters that exist entirely outside your influence. Chasing a specific, consistent image across every relationship and every interaction is therefore not simply exhausting. It is structurally impossible, since the final image formed in each listener's mind depends on variables you cannot access or adjust. Recognizing this impossibility changes the nature of the pursuit. Rather than continuing an unwinnable effort to control perception, energy can be redirected towards something entirely achievable, living and speaking in alignment with your actual values and reasoning, and allowing the resulting impression to form, however it forms, in each individual mind, without attempting to micromanage the outcome. This does not mean becoming careless or indifferent to how your words might land. It means shifting the underlying motivation from control toward honesty, from managing an image toward simply being accurately represented by your actual behavior, trusting that this accuracy, over time, tends to produce far steadier relationships than any managed image ever could. There is a particular kind of exhaustion, specific to image management, that becomes visible only once it stops. People who have spent years carefully curating how they are perceived often describe a profound, almost disorienting relief when they finally allow themselves to simply be seen as they actually are, including the parts that do not fit the polished image they had previously maintained. This relief reveals just how much energy the management itself had been consuming, energy that had become so normalized it was no longer registered as effort at all, simply as the ordinary cost of existing around other people. Letting go of image management also requires tolerating a specific discomfort, the discomfort of being seen inaccurately by people who only ever encountered the curated version, and the discomfort of potentially disappointing expectations that were built around that curated image rather than around the actual person underneath it. This discomfort is real, and it does not disappear instantly. but it tends to lessen considerably once a person recognizes that relationships built entirely around a managed image were never actually stable in the first place, since they depended on the exhausting, unsustainable maintenance of something that was never quite real to begin with. Relationships capable of surviving the transition toward greater honesty tend to become significantly more resilient afterward, precisely because they are now built on something accurate rather than something carefully performed. This release does not happen all at once. It tends to unfold gradually, one small moment of honesty at a time, one resisted urge to manage an impression at a time, one tolerated discomfort at a time. Each of these small moments builds capacity for the next, gradually loosening a grip that may have been held so long. It initially felt like an essential part of identity, rather than a habit that could be examined and changed. What eventually remains, once this labor is set down, is something considerably lighter. A way of moving through relationships that no longer requires constant internal calculation, because there is no longer a specific image being protected, only an actual person, allowed finally to exist without the burden of managing every impression formed about them. Chapter 12. What remains? When you stop defending yourself. Imagine for a moment the sheer volume of internal activity that accompanies a habit of constant self-defense. Every criticism scanned for validity and threat. Every disagreement met with an internal rebuttal, rehearsed even if never spoken aloud. Every questioning look interpreted, analyzed, prepared for. This activity runs almost continuously in certain minds, a kind of background process consuming resources so consistently that its absence, when it finally occurs, feels almost startling, like a noise that has been present for so long it was mistaken for silence, until it finally stops, and genuine silence becomes audible for the first time. Defense, in this context, refers to something broader than simply arguing back when criticized. It includes the subtler forms too, the internal justification that runs even when no one has actually challenged you, the anticipatory explanation prepared for objections that may never actually arrive, the quiet vigilance that treats nearly every interaction as a potential site of attack requiring readiness. This defensive posture often develops for understandable reasons, frequently rooted in earlier experiences, where genuine vulnerability led to genuine harm, where letting the guard down did at some point result in real consequences. The posture made sense once. The question worth asking honestly is whether it still serves its original purpose in the present, or whether it has become a habit maintained long after the original threat has passed. What becomes available once defense is no longer the automatic response to criticism or doubt. The first and perhaps most immediate change involves the sheer amount of mental space that opens up. A mind no longer occupied with constant readiness for attack has considerably more room available for actual thought, actual creativity, actual presence in the current moment, rather than anticipation of a future confrontation that may never materialize. This spaciousness is difficult to fully appreciate until it is directly experienced, since a mind accustomed to constant defensive activity often does not realize how much of its capacity has been consumed by that activity, until the activity finally quiets. A second change involves the quality of listening that becomes possible. A person engaged in internal defense, even quiet, invisible defense, is never fully listening to what another person is actually saying, because a portion of their attention remains occupied with preparing a response, monitoring for threat, calculating the appropriate rebuttal. Once defense recedes, listening can become considerably more complete, more genuinely curious about what the other person means, rather than focused on how to respond to it. This shift often improves relationships in ways that extend well beyond the specific issue of misunderstanding. Since genuine listening tends to be recognized and appreciated by others, even when they cannot articulate exactly why a particular conversation felt different from the ones that came before. A third change, perhaps the most significant, involves the relationship a person develops with criticism itself. Without the automatic reflex of defense, criticism can be received and evaluated on its actual merits, rather than reflexively resisted, regardless of whether it contains anything useful. Some criticism, examined without defensive filtering, genuinely contains valuable information, insight that can be incorporated to improve future decisions or behavior. Defensive posture makes this kind of evaluation nearly impossible, since everything arriving in the form of criticism gets treated as an attack requiring resistance, rather than information requiring consideration. Releasing defense allows criticism to be sorted more accurately. Some of it genuinely useful and worth incorporating, some of it inaccurate or irrelevant, and worth simply releasing without a fight. But either way, evaluated rather than reflexively resisted. This does not mean becoming passive or unable to advocate for yourself when genuine advocacy is warranted. There remains an important distinction between defensive reactivity and clear, calm self-advocacy offered when a situation genuinely calls for it. The difference lies in the underlying state from which the response emerges. Defensive reactivity emerges from an activated, anxious internal state, responding to perceived threat, regardless of whether real threat exists. Calm self-advocacy emerges from a settled internal state, capable of stating a position clearly, precisely, because it does not depend on winning the other person's agreement in order to feel secure. The words used in each case might occasionally overlook similar, but the internal experience, and often the eventual outcome, differ considerably. What ultimately remains, once habitual defense has been examined and gradually released, is a kind of durability that feels qualitatively different from the fragile strength that constant vigilance once provided. It is the durability of a person who can hear disagreement, criticism, or misunderstanding without immediately needing to neutralize it, because their sense of self no longer depends on winning every exchange or correcting every inaccurate impression. This durability was never actually available through defense itself, no matter how skillfully that defense was executed. It only became available once the defense was finally set down, revealing a stability that had been present all along, simply obscured by the constant activity of protecting something that, it turns out, did not actually need that particular kind of protection to remain intact. Chapter 13. Living among assumptions without absorbing them. Every day, in ways so constant they rarely register as notable events, other people form quick judgments and assumptions about you. A stranger glances at your appearance and forms an instant, largely unconscious impression. A colleague hears a brief update about your work and constructs an assumption about your competence or priorities. An acquaintance learns a single fact about your life and builds an entire narrative around it, filling gaps with guesses shaped by their own experience rather than yours. This constant stream of assumption is simply the ordinary background hum of existing among other conscious minds, each one constantly interpreting, categorizing, and drawing conclusions, often with only a fraction of the actual information required to do so accurately. Most people absorb far more of this ambient assumption than they realize. An offhand comment from someone barely known can lodge itself uncomfortably in the mind for days, quietly shaping self-perception, even though the person who made the comment likely forgot it within minutes. This absorption happens automatically, without conscious permission, because the mind, still operating partly on the old association between comprehension and safety explored earlier in this journey, treats every assumption, regardless of its source or accuracy, as potentially significant information worth internalizing. Learning to live among constant assumption without absorbing all of it requires developing a specific kind of discernment, one that separates the simple fact of an assumption's existence from any obligation to internalize or respond to it. An assumption is, after all, simply a thought that exists inside someone else's mind. It does not require your agreement to exist there, and its existence there does not automatically transfer any weight or truth into your own self-understanding, unless you actively choose to grant it that weight. This distinction, though simple to state, takes considerable practice to genuinely internalize, since the automatic habit of absorption tends to operate faster than conscious, deliberate discernment. One useful practice involves noticing the specific moment when an assumption begins to be absorbed, catching the transition as it happens, rather than only recognizing it afterward, once the assumption has already settled uncomfortably into self-perception. This transition often has a recognizable feeling, a kind of internal tightening, or a shift toward defensive rehearsal, the mind beginning to construct a rebuttal or justification in response to something someone else briefly thought. Noticing this transition as it begins creates a small but meaningful gap, a moment where a choice becomes available that did not seem available before. The choice to let the assumption remain simply an assumption, existing in someone else's mind, without following it into your own. This practice becomes considerably easier once it is paired with an accurate understanding of how little most assumptions actually reflect about you specifically. As explored in earlier chapters, an assumption formed by someone who does not know you well is built primarily from their own filters, their own history, their own current concerns, projected onto the sparse information they happen to have about your situation. A colleague who assumes you are disorganized because you missed one meeting is very likely revealing something about their own standards, their own past experiences with unreliability, or simply their limited information, far more than they are revealing any accurate insight into your actual character. Recognizing this dynamic consistently makes it considerably easier to let such assumptions pass through awareness without settling into it, since their origin becomes visible as belonging more to the observer than to the observed. There is also real value in distinguishing between assumptions that arrive from people whose perspective genuinely matters to your life, and assumptions that arrive from people whose perspective, however confidently stated, carries little actual relevance to anything that matters. Not every assumption deserves equal internal weight, simply because it was expressed with confidence or volume. A close, trusted friend's honest concern about a pattern they have noticed over years deserves real consideration, precisely because it is built from sustained, caring attention. A stranger's confident judgment, built from a single interaction and colored by their own unrelated frustrations, deserves considerably less weight, regardless of how certain or forceful it sounded in the moment. Learning to sort assumptions by the quality of their source, rather than by the intensity with which they were delivered, prevents an enormous amount of unnecessary internal disturbance. Over time, with consistent practice, living among constant assumption begins to feel less like walking through a minefield and more like walking through weather. Present, sometimes even mildly interesting to observe, but rarely requiring the kind of urgent internal response it once seemed to demand. Assumptions continue arriving, because that is simply what happens when other minds interpret an incomplete picture of your life. But their arrival stops automatically translating into internal disturbance, because a clear distinction has finally been established between what other people momentarily believe and what you actually, carefully know to be true about yourself. Chapter 14. The freedom of an unexplained life. There is a particular kind of stillness available at the far end of everything explored throughout this journey, one that can be difficult to imagine from the starting point. Back when misunderstanding still felt like emergency, and every unclear impression seemed to demand immediate correction. This stillness does not arrive through achieving perfect communication, nor through finally becoming universally understood by everyone encountered. It arrives through something quieter and more durable, the recognition that your life was never actually required to be fully explained, fully justified, or fully comprehended by anyone else in order to be genuinely, fully yours. Consider what has actually shifted across this exploration. The early belief that understanding equals safety, an ancient inheritance from infancy, has been examined and recognized as an outdated alarm rather than an accurate signal of present danger. The recognition that every explanation meets a different mind, shaped by history and filters entirely outside your control, has released the impossible burden of guaranteeing comprehension through wording alone. The hidden costs of constant clarification, the drained energy, the eroded self-trust have been named clearly enough to be noticed and interrupted going forward. The uncomfortable but freeing truth that some people are not actually seeking understanding has spared enormous wasted effort directed at minds unwilling to shift, regardless of the clarity offered. Beyond this, the crucial distinction between being known and being approved of has separated a genuinely healthy desire for connection from an endless, unwinnable pursuit of universal agreement. The recognition that misunderstanding is not evidence against your character has dismantled the internal courtroom that once convened at every misread comment. The quiet confidence, built through deliberately letting minor misunderstandings stand, has replaced the fragile strength that constant correction once provided. The counterintuitive discovery that over-explaining trains listeners toward doubt rather than trust has offered a genuinely different approach to communication, one built on calm brevity rather than anxious elaboration. The internal reference point, built patiently through honest reflection rather than borrowed from momentary external approval, now offers a stable place to check decisions against, one that does not shift with every passing reaction from someone else, the recognition of which relationships actually carry genuine attunement, built through sustained, judgment-free attention, has redirected energy away from impossible expectations and toward the specific connections capable of providing real, effortless understanding. The release of image management, the labor of controlling perception, has freed enormous energy previously spent maintaining something that was never quite real to begin with. The retirement of habitual defense has opened space for genuine listening and honest evaluation of criticism, rather than reflexive resistance to anything that resembled a threat. and the practice of living among constant ambient assumption, without absorbing all of it, has established a durable distinction between what others momentarily believe and what you actually carefully know. Taken together, these shifts point towards something larger than any single insight among them. They point toward a fundamentally different way of inhabiting a life among other people, one where clarity is offered generously when it is genuinely useful, but never desperately, never as a plea for safety that comprehension was never actually capable of providing in the first place. This is the freedom of an unexplained life, not a life lived in secrecy or withdrawal, not a life indifferent to genuine connection, but a life no longer organized around the anxious pursuit of guaranteed understanding from every person encountered along the way. This freedom does not mean misunderstanding will stop occurring. It will continue, regularly, in small and occasionally larger forms, for as long as separate minds continue attempting to reach across the gap that exists between them. What changes is not the frequency of misunderstanding, but its weight, the amount of internal disturbance it generates once it arrives. Where misunderstanding once triggered urgent correction and anxious rehearsal, it now often passes through awareness with considerably less resistance, recognized for what it actually is: an ordinary, unavoidable feature of communication between different minds, rather than a verdict requiring immediate appeal. What remains, in the quiet space where anxious explanation once lived, is something sturdier and considerably more peaceful. It is the steady, internal knowledge of your own reasoning, your own values, your own honest account of why you have lived and chosen as you have, a knowledge that does not require external ratification to remain true. Other people will continue to see you through their own filters, sometimes accurately, sometimes not, and this will continue to be, as it always was, a reflection primarily of their own minds, rather than a final judgment on yours. Your task was never to make every mind you encounter align perfectly with the truth of who you are. Your task, quieter and considerably more achievable, was simply to know that truth yourself, clearly enough that its accuracy no longer depends on anyone else's recognition of it at all.